Hey friends, I'm Cammie.
And I'm Liam.
And this is the show where I introduce this here 13-year-old to classic movies from the 80s and 90s. This is From Mad Max to The Matrix. Today was the spotlight on 1981. We watched The Road Warrior and Raiders of the Lost Ark. My first question for you, now that we're 4 episodes into this, well, 3 episodes of watching movies into this, how's the project going for you? Are you enjoying it?
Yeah.
Yeah? It hasn't gotten tedious at all for you?
No.
Okay, good. First movie we watched was The Road Warrior, and the first thing we do is we give it a star rating. 1 to 5 stars, hated it, didn't like it, liked it, really liked it, loved it. How many stars would you give The Road Warrior?
Probably a 5, because it didn't seem to have any of the pacing issues that the first one did.
Yep.
And that was the only reason I gave the other one 4.
If you look at my notes, do you see what it says right there? Pacing. I wanted to ask you about that. When I ask you for the summary of the movie, what I mean is kind of explain what happens. Like if you were trying to get somebody to watch it and they said, oh, The Road Warrior, what's that about? So how would you summarize The Road Warrior?
I don't know, honestly.
Would you say it's kind of a post-apocalyptic movie about a guy?
Yeah, definitely.
Who, what happens in the movie?
He tries to get gas for his car.
Yep.
That's literally the entire plot of the movie.
Definitely for the first half. I would argue that not so much for the latter part of the movie. To put this movie in context, it is, of course, a sequel to Mad Max, which we watched 2 weeks ago. So same writer and director, George Miller. Same star, Mel Gibson, played Max again. The entire rest of the cast is completely different. It introduces a guy named Bruce Spence, plays the gyro captain. I don't think we're going to be seeing him again. And we won't be seeing George Miller again. We will see Mel Gibson a few times. He was a pretty big star in the 80s.
Wait, which George Miller was the gyro captain?
No, George Miller was the writer and director. He did do a bunch of other movies, but these are the only ones we're going to be watching. In the 2000s, he did the Happy Feet movies. Did you see those?
I didn't.
About the dancing penguins. He also did the Babe sequel, Babe 2, Pig in the City. This movie kind of, I don't want to say launched the career of Mel Gibson, but it kind of also launched the international career of Mel Gibson. The first Mad Max movie was really popular in Australia. So when they made this one, they of course had a bigger budget and stuff like that. They had to release it internationally. And so people in the United States and Europe kind of got to know who he was. The movie also, because it was so popular, it kind of popularized the post-apocalyptic genre as we know it today. Did you notice a lot of the same tropes of other movies? Have you seen a lot of other movies kind of like that?
I don't think I have.
You don't think you have? Through the 80s, there was a whole slew of Mad Max knockoffs.
Doesn't surprise me.
The other big thing about this movie is, did you notice that I keep calling it The Road Warrior, but when we watched it, the title card pops up and it says Mad Max 2? I touched a little bit on that back when we watched Mad Max. I want you to take a guess about why it might have 2 titles.
Because Max is the Road Warrior.
Yep.
And it's about Max.
Yep, the narrator calls him the Road Warrior at the beginning. Okay, so when the movie was released internationally, Mad Max the first one was not released internationally. So people outside Australia had no idea who the character was, no idea who the movie was about. When it was released internationally, it wasn't released as Mad Max 2 because people wouldn't have gone to see it if it was a sequel to a movie that they didn't know about.
Makes sense.
So it was rebranded The Road Warrior, and it was released as The Road Warrior. It wasn't released as Mad Max 2 until the 2000s. And what's also interesting, because this movie was so popular, the first movie got a home video release internationally, which is how I saw it, but they dubbed everything.
Oh yeah, you told me about this.
Yep.
Because they had to make it so people could actually understand what the Australian people were saying.
Yep. Which I think is kind of insane because Mad Max 2 was released internationally. It wasn't dubbed.
Because no one liked that it was dubbed.
Well, no, because Mad Max 2 was released in theaters and stuff. So people saw that. And because it was popular, the first one then got released internationally on home video. But it was dubbed.
So they watched the second one, and then because the second one was popular, they watched the first one.
Yep. Makes very little sense. And the first one wasn't released with the original audio until the DVD release in the early 2000s. Do you have any questions for me about this movie?
No.
All right.
Actually, I do have one.
Okay, shoot.
How do they do the flamethrowers?
By making a literal flamethrower. You mean like how did the prop work?
Yeah.
Yeah, by making just a literal flamethrower. That's the same way they did the flamethrowers in Alien.
Yep.
That's why it looks so good. Oh, another little interesting thing about this movie is when the refinery blows up. Oh, no restraint on spoilers for any of the movies that we discuss here on From Mad Max to The Matrix. So when they blow up the refinery towards the end, that was one of the largest explosions ever filmed at the time. They took the entire set, that giant set out in the desert that they filmed all the stuff in, and they blew that up. It wasn't a model of the set that they blew
literally
up.
blew the set up.
They blew the set up. That's why it looks so good.
I mean, it's like the flamethrower. If you build the real thing, it looks better than if you try and make it look like the real thing.
Yeah. When people talk about effects, they talk about practical effects versus like digital effects now. But back then, of course, there wasn't digital effects. So the difference was between what they call in camera. So it's an effect that was captured like when it was shot. So it would be the blowing up the entire set rather than a miniature blowing up the miniature. I think it looks fantastic. How would you say that the movie has aged? How does it watch for a modern audience or someone of your generation?
It watches really well.
The other question that I have for you is you mentioned the pacing. So you felt that it was paced well?
Yeah.
There wasn't any real down points? Wasn't any places where it dragged?
The most down point was when they all went to the refinery.
When Max is at the refinery?
Yeah, yeah. When the whole gang came to the refinery and was like, give us the gas.
Yeah. And Lord Humongous does his little speech.
Yeah.
One of the things that sets this movie apart from other movies at the time is its pacing. We've watched movies that led up to this. If you think about the movies that we watched previously, they were a lot slower paced. This movie and Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of set a precedent for much faster paced movies with like longer action scenes. Another thing that set this movie apart is the action sequence at the end. From the moment that they drive the rig out of the compound until the end of the movie.
It's a car movie.
Yeah, it's absolutely a car movie. But it's a non-stop action sequence. That action sequence goes on for 14 minutes, which is just absolutely unheard of at the time. The longest you would have an action scene is maybe 5-6 minutes. George Miller just puts the gas on and doesn't stop. The beginning of the movie also is about 14 minutes of just like Max zipping around in the car and getting chased by biker nomads. And he doesn't even say anything for the first 14 minutes of the movie.
Yeah.
The pacing is one of the big things that made this movie so popular. What did you think of the truck stunt where they rolled the truck over?
I'm figuring they just rolled a truck over with no one inside it.
No, there had to be someone inside it to control it. So they have a stunt driver, and they had a truck full of sand already, because if they try and do... Anytime you see like a rig like that, a tanker truck, in a movie, it's usually full of sand. Because if it's empty, it's too light, and it'll bounce around on the road. But if it's full of liquid, the liquid sloshes around inside, and it makes driving the truck really difficult. So they filled them with sand. The stunt driver flipped the truck and rolled it, and was able to land it exactly on his mark. And it was one of the first movies he ever worked on. And if they had screwed up that stunt, the finale of the movie kind of would have been ruined. What's really interesting about that particular stunt driver, in the most recent Mad Max movie that came out in 2015, he also does a truck roll, which is a bit more dramatic. But he was getting ready to retire. And he came back to work on Mad Max, and the last stunt he did was rolling another rig in a Mad Max movie.
First and last.
Yep. What would you say this movie is, like if we were to talk meta commentary, the theme and the meaning of the movie, what would you say this movie, or how did this movie say anything to you? How would you read this movie?
I don't really see a theme in that movie.
Okay. We mentioned it. We talked briefly about it yesterday. And I'm sure as soon as I say this, you'll be like, oh yeah. In the first movie, we talked about the themes of heroes and anti-heroes. I feel like that really carries through to this movie too. Whereas in the last one, he started out trying not to be an anti-hero outright villain. But in this one, he starts out like that and has what a lot of people would call a redemption arc. Once he loses everything, he could just wander off into the wasteland, but he goes back to the compound and is like, I'll drive your truck. I'll make sure you people get to safety. I would say he gets his redemption after losing his mind and like just murdering his way through all those bikers in the first movie. But I feel like this one, he kind of has a redemption and is a good guy by the end.
aside from the compound, there were only like two good people, and at the end, one of them was Max, and the other one was the gyro captain.
Yep, pretty much. Because all the main characters from the compound were on the rig, were helping defend the rig. What did you think of that twist at the end when the rig flips over?
That one was, it made my brain hurt because it was full of sand the whole time.
Yep. Your mind exploded a little bit when you found out who the narrator was.
Yeah.
Do you want to elaborate on that? Like, what was going through your head when you found out the big reveal? Well, what was the big reveal, and then kind of what was going through your head?
Which one, the narrator or
the one about the narrator?
I mean, I guess it makes sense. He was the one he was with Max the whole time.
Yep.
So he would have been able to narrate all of it.
Yeah, the reveal that the feral kid who has no lines aside from throwing boomerangs, and yeah. The next movie we watched was Raiders of the Lost Ark, and what would you give that for a star rating?
Probably a 4.
A 4? Okay.
Or maybe a 3, because there were a lot of points where it was just, there wasn't any action.
Yeah, I can see that. Like, a big part of the second act, after he gets the job from the army people, not much happens for a little while. I can see that. It's a lot of digging and stuff. How would you summarize this movie?
I would say that he went and attempted to find a lost artifact that would render whoever wielded it able to destroy anything or anybody.
And who is he trying to stop from getting it?
The Nazis.
The Nazis. Yep. Did you... When we were watching Blues Brothers last week, you didn't expect Nazis to suddenly show up?
No. I didn't expect it in that movie either.
This movie, since it takes place in the 1930s, it's a little more expected for me. But yeah, in Blues Brothers, they kind of come out of nowhere.
Yeah. Then again, a lot of things in that movie come out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's the way Dan Aykroyd writes. Okay, so some context for the movie. There were a few names that I'm sure you recognized. Like you noticed, it was produced by Lucasfilm, which was George Lucas. We've talked about a couple times already. And it was directed by Steven Spielberg. Do you know who that is?
Yes.
Has he made any other movies that you've watched that
Yes.
you loved? What were they? You're going to kick yourself as soon as I
Was he
remind
the same guy that did Dark Crystal and Labyrinth?
Nope, that was Jim Henson.
Oh, yeah.
Steven Spielberg in the 90s did Jurassic Park in 93 and then Hook in 94, 95.
I actually watched, I think, the first Jurassic Park movie.
Yep. He directed the first one. He directed the second one, which was garbage, but he had nothing to do with any of the other ones. He also directed in, I want to say 2019, but he directed Ready Player One.
Oh.
Yep. He's directed a lot of really, really good stuff. We'll be talking about him again later because I definitely want to talk about Jurassic Park when 93 rolls around. So this is also a good example of George Lucas writing and producing a movie but not directing. So just like last week when
And
we
also
talked
doing
about
a movie
Empire.
that's not Star Wars.
George Lucas was incredibly influential on movies pretty much up until he retired in like around, when did he retire? 2011, 2012? So he was incredibly influential for a long time. He started Lucasfilm, which is his production company. He also started a special effects group called Industrial Light and Magic. They went on to become one of the biggest, most prominent special effects companies. So they did a lot of model work. They do a lot of computer animation. Like they did all the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park.
Well, I figured they didn't use real dinosaurs.
Yeah, it would have been a lot more difficult. I mean, Steven Spielberg's a hell of a director, but I doubt he would have gone back and gotten real dinos. You mentioned the pacing of the movie. This movie also kind of set the groundwork for the pacing of movies going forward. And that's why I think pairing these movies is pretty cool. Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of drags a little bit in the first part. Well, okay, so when I talk about acts of a movie, do you know what I mean? So an act is just a way of kind of breaking down the story and looking at how the story moves. So most movies fall into what's called a 3-act structure. So the first quarter or so of the movie is the first act. During the first act, we're kind of introduced to the characters and the world and stuff like that. And then when the character goes off on whatever their quest adventure is, that transitions us into the second act, which is where they're going on their adventure. And then the third act is like they face off against the bad guy and all the end stuff happens.
Yeah.
So like Mad Max has a pretty clear first, second, and third act where when he meets the gyro captain, it's kind of the beginning of the second act and they go to the compound. And then when he decides to drive the truck, it's kind of the beginning of the third act. So in Raiders, kind of the first act is up until he meets the army guys. And then the third act is kind of when he hops on the submarine. Kind of the first half of the second act is he takes the job and then it drags a little bit. A lot of movies, that first half of the second act, that part that you thought dragged, would have been the entirety of the second act.
Yeah.
Like, that's just how movies were paced in the 70s. And these two movies that we watched really kind of changed that. Like, think of Alien. The chest burster doesn't even come out until almost halfway through the movie.
Well, yeah, but it wouldn't make much sense if we just started with him. Yeah, he has a thing on his head. No.
Yeah, that movie, it uses its pace incredibly well to build tone, but that's just kind of how movies were made back then. And these two movies kind of changed that, and people started making more fast-paced action movies. Do you have any questions for me about Raiders? You asked me a couple of things that I think I answered while we were watching it.
No, you didn't answer them. You said you would remember them, but I can't remember what they were.
You asked me how they...
Snakes!
Oh, yeah. So the way they do stuff like that is they do have live snakes, but they didn't have thousands of live snakes.
They had a few live snakes and then a few of, like, plastic snakes or something.
Yeah, it's thousands of rubber snakes.
And then whenever one of them moves, they'll have a real snake.
Yep. If you're seeing it moving, it's a live snake. One thing that's really interesting about using snakes on a movie set is all the lights are really bright, so a movie set gets really, really warm. Snakes, when it gets warm, they don't want to move. They just lay there. So a live snake, most of the time, will look like a rubber snake. So what they do is they have production people who go around basically and poke the snakes just before the camera starts running.
They literally poke the snakes?
Yeah, I mean, not hard, but just like a little nudge to get them kind of slithering around and moving. Otherwise, they look exactly like a rubber snake. It's hilarious. They had the same problem when they used snakes in Empire Strikes Back. On Dagobah, there were a bunch of snakes kind of like hanging out on trees and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're hard to notice because they look like rubber snakes if they're not poked. And this was the movie that they made right after they got done with Empire. With a different director, but same people. Steven Spielberg had a lot to do behind the scenes with the Star Wars movies because he and George Lucas are friends. Steven Spielberg, actually, speaking of him real quick, he was really, really popular in the 70s also. He made some movies that kind of changed the way people made movies back then too. Like he did Jaws in the 70s. I know you probably haven't seen it, but are you familiar with it at all?
I've heard it.
Yeah.
I've heard of it.
It's basically about a giant shark that terrorizes a small coastal town. Yeah, so he was already pretty prominent and popular by the time he made Raiders. Oh, you didn't realize this was an Indiana Jones movie because it didn't say Indiana Jones.
Yeah, I heard Raiders of the Lost Ark and I figured, oh, it's one of those kinds of movies.
Yeah, the very first movie didn't have Indiana Jones' name on it. After the second one, because the second one was called Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Yeah, the point when I realized it was an Indiana Jones movie was the idol.
Yep, that very opening scene. One of the most iconic scenes in movie history. The boulder.
But I was joking when I said that, oh, a boulder's going to fall down, because I figured, oh, it's not an Indiana Jones movie. That won't happen.
Yep. The movie now is released as Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
But that wouldn't make sense, because Indiana Jones... No, Indiana Jones didn't read... No, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark would make sense, because the Germans are pretty much the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yep. Led by Belloc and... I forgot the other guy's name. The Nazi who grabs the medallion and has it burned into his hand.
I don't think they ever mentioned his name, actually.
Do, but they only mention his name like once or twice. And I don't remember what it is. I could look it up, but I don't care. It doesn't matter. We know who we're talking about. And anyone following along at home knows who we're talking about. You also mentioned the music while we were watching it. Indiana Jones's theme. Dun, 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 dun. I'm doing it wrong. Anyway, you said you'd heard it before.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's, again, one of the most iconic film scores in music history. Music was done by a guy named John Williams, who also worked on the Star Wars movies. So he did the Star Wars theme, and then he did the Indiana Jones theme, and they're both incredibly popular, iconic film scores. Did you get any kind of theme or meaning out of this movie? Like, what did it say to you? How would you read it?
It didn't seem like there was a theme in that movie.
I would say that it has, at the very least, the theme Nazis are bad and should be stopped.
Well, yeah, but that's something you should already know.
Well, fair, but even the most shallow of themes can still be
A theme, yeah.
a theme, yeah. The most shallow and obvious of themes, Nazis bad. I agree with you that it's not really about anything. And sometimes movies are just, they're about being a good movie and being fun and being exciting and stuff. And I agree that I think that's mostly what Raiders of the Lost Ark is trying to do. There's no big character arcs. There's some passing themes of like science versus faith, and this belongs in a museum, not in some private collection, but it's not really about those things. So I agree with you. The other thing, and I made this joke yesterday, I made it up on the spot and I was very proud of it. When the Nazis finally open the Ark at the end, do you remember what they find inside?
Sand.
Sand. So it's 2 movies in a row where the thing that everybody's trying to get is full of sand.
I'm wondering, did someone fill it with sand? Or over time did the chunks of stone tablet turn into sand?
That's what they imply. They imply that the treasure inside the 10 Commandment tablets kind of eroded over time because it's been thousands of years. What did you think of the effects of the main characters, the main villains, at the end when all the energy's coming out? Do you remember what happened to their heads?
Or they melted.
Yeah, there was the one guy exploded. One guy turned all old and fell over. And then there was the lead Nazi guy whose face melted. I want you to take a guess. How do you think they did that effect?
I think that they put one of those, what are they called? The little explosives? The ones that
squib?
Yeah, those. I think they put one of those in a, basically, mannequin of one of the Nazis to explode it. They melted a version of the lead Nazi, and I think they did maybe some sort of stop motion for the old guy.
Yep, that's exactly what they did. They had fake heads, and one was stop motion. One was just a fake head made out of plastic and plaster that they had explosives inside and just exploded. And the other one they made out of wax, but they made multiple layers. So they had the insides of his head, the brains and eyeballs and stuff. And then they had the skull was another layer of wax. And then the flesh and stuff over top of that was another layer of wax.
So that way when they melted it, you would see all of his stuff.
And they basically just hit it with heat guns, recorded it melting, and then sped it up so it happens fast. It looks great. I think it's really... Oh, how would you say this movie has held up? I don't know if I asked you that yet.
Really good.
I agree. I feel like we're at a point in the movies going forward that work better for modern audiences, mostly because these 2 movies kind of changed the way movies were made. Do you have anything else you want to add about either of these movies? About the whole process?
I feel like I asked this yesterday. Did they literally light a building on fire for the bar?
It's a controlled fire when they do it on a movie set. So they've got someone who just there to control the fire. That's their entire job.
That's an important job.
It's a very important job because you don't want the whole movie set to burn down. So they know exactly where the fire is going to be, and they control exactly where the actors and the crew are, so nobody will get hurt.
Oh, I have one more question.
Okay.
How did they do the thing on the guy's hand?
Latex. They just made a fake burn and then glued it to his hand, basically.
Yeah.
That's most of the time when you see wounds in movies, it's latex. I've done it before in movies I've made. I did a movie once where I got a glancing blow from a shotgun on my arm, on my left arm, right here. And my effects producer made a latex, raw flesh and peeled skin around it. And then we kind of glued it to my arm and covered it in fake blood. And I ripped my shirt around it because somebody came at me with a shotgun. I ducked away just as the barrel was over my arm. So it peeled off the top of my arm. But that's how they do it. It's a prosthetic. I think that about wraps it up for today.
Yeah.
We're going to be taking next week off. We won't be here. We're doing family stuff. The next episode, so in 2 weeks, we're going to spotlight 1982. We're going to talk about a handful of movies that you've already seen from 1982. But we're also going to watch Blade Runner, Conan the Barbarian, and Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. You've asked a few times about Star Trek. I don't think you've seen any Star Trek. Your mom and I are both big Star Trek fans, and we've talked about it a bunch.
But you can only watch Star Wars or Star Trek.
Get out. You keep that nonsense up, I'm going to make you watch Eraserhead. For those of you at home, if you enjoy what we do and want to kind of help the show out, help the channel out, you can join my Patreon, patreon.com/CarmillaTLV. It's like my name, CARMILLA, and then the letters T, L, and V. That goes to support not just this, but all my internet shenanigans and my writing. You want to throw some money in my tip jar? You can do so paypal.me/CarmillaTLV, just like the Patreon. All the money goes to doing things like getting movies for Liam and I to watch and getting us more time and better equipment and stuff. Thanks for hanging out. And thanks obviously for sitting down with me. I have a lot of fun doing this. A lot of
Me
fun
too.
watching movies with you. Cool. Do you want to say goodbye to everybody?
Bye.